When we study ancient Indian royalty, one practical question that appears is, what did the kings wear on their heads? Was it like what we see in the movies and TV serials, like a majestic golden crown studded with gems? Or is it something else? Across different periods and regions, India had many dynasties, each with its own administrative structure, cultural practice, and visual symbols of authority. But was the primary royal marker a metal crown, a cloth turban, a diadem, or a combination of these? Well, there is no uniform answer because India's political history is not uniform. The north had its own traditions shaped by the climate, warfare, and local customs. South followed different conventions influenced by temple culture and court protocols. The west, especially the Maratha and Rajput region, developed distinct forms of headgear tied closely to their identity and status. The east, including Bengal, Odisha, Assam, etc., they reflected another set of practices visible in sculptures, manuscripts, and inscriptions. So the question becomes broader. What did different dynasties adopt as their standard royal headdress? Did coronation ceremonies use something different from everyday court life? Did military needs influence what the rulers wore? Did foreign contacts change the design or material over time? This video begins by outlining this question clearly, not to conclude immediately, but just to answer this one simple question. Did they wear crowns or turbans? Actually, this is a question that someone sent to me in the DM. Quite an interesting one. So that's the reason I thought of making a very short video on this one. So let's get started. Let's start with some random instances. This is a coin of Samudragupta from around 335 to 375 AD, almost 1700 years ago. The reverse shows that the Garuda Stambham, which is the emblem of the Gupta Empire. On the obverse, we can see the king's headdress clearly. It's not a metal crown in later European sense. Instead, it appears to be a pointed or semi-conical cloth wrap. The folds indicate a wrapped turban-like structure, and around the base there is a decorative golden band. This band is what we usually call a diadem, a metal strip that helps hold the cloth in its shape while adding that royal aesthetic. This is one of the possibilities most scholars mention when discussing Gupta headdresses. It is not my personal interpretation. This is widely recorded in numismatic studies, that is, study of the coins of Gupta coinage. Based on this particular coin, I simply recreated how that headdress might have looked in real life. So what we are seeing here is essentially a turban combined with a diadem, not a solid metal crown. And this style seems consistent across several Gupta era depictions of kings. Now we move to one of the oldest surviving visual depictions of the royal headdresses in the subcontinent. The representations of Emperor Ashoka of the Mauryan dynasty, dated roughly to 268 to 232 BCE, that is more than 2200 years ago. In several Mauryan period carvings, particularly at Sanchi and other early Buddhist sites associated with Ashoka, the king is shown wearing a cloth-based headdress. It is not a crown in latter metal sense, but a wrapped form of turban kind of thing that resembles an early style of what we know today. Based on these carvings, I have recreated a possible version of how Ashoka's headdress might have looked. The sculptures clearly show a rounded cloth wrapped on the top as a knot. A diadem is not visible in the surviving stone reliefs, but considering that Ashoka's imperial status is an emperor end of the day, so it is reasonable to assume that his headdress would have included some form of ornamentation, jewels or gems, This reconstruction reflects that possibly while staying close to what is observable in the original art. So this is the depiction, what you're seeing in the carvings, 2200 years old carvings. So naturally this gives us the exact replica of how people were back then, and especially Ashoka the Great. Now what is important here is the consistency. Across almost all known Mauryan carvings, Ashoka is depicted with this style of cloth headdress. This already challenges the modern pop culture idea of ancient Indian kings wearing heavy metal crowns. Those cinematic depictions, they are not fully aligned with what our earliest archaeological evidence shows. However, this does not mean that metal crowns did not exist at all. We will discuss those cases a little later. But from the Mauryan period onward, which is definitely one of the vast empires that India ever had, I think the answer is quite clear in front of you. When we move forward the timeline into Emperor Kanishka around 127 to 150 CE, we notice a slight evolution in the headdress design. The basic structure still resembles a wrapped turban, but the form becomes somewhat different. On Kanishka's coins, the lower rim appears thicker and more pronounced, while the upper portion tapers with a smaller and more compact cranium area as it rises. Culturally speaking, there is a gap of almost 400 years between Ashoka and Kanishka, Ashoka being the older one. Yet, the continuity in headgear style is quite evident. It is highly plausible that the general concept of a cloth-based royal headdress continued with regional and dynastic variations over time. This recreation is based slightly on the visual clues from the Kanishka's original coin, which clearly shows, again, a wrapped cloth rather than a solid metal crown. Again, I repeat, these are not my interpretations. Just try to do a bit of research on how these interpretations were made. I just picked up cues from the official sources. So again, even in Kushan period, nearly 1800 to 1900 years ago, we see the same broad pattern, royal authority being expressed through a structured turban-like headdress, often paired with a decorated rim or a diadem, rather than a crown imagery which we associate with the later pop culture that we have today. Moving forward, and having said that, this does not mean metal crowns were absent in ancient India. In the same broad period, we see a different tradition among Western Kshatrapas, who ruled parts of present-day Gujarat, Maharashtra and Western Madhya Pradesh. The coin of King Vijayasena, dated roughly to around 238 to 250 CE, is a good example. On these coins, not only Vijayasena but for several other Western Kshatrapa rulers, the headdress appears smooth, rounded and uniform, very different from the cloth-wrapped turbans of Mauryan and Kushan period. This style suggests a possible metal crown or a metal headpiece with minimalistic shaping. Based on the curvature and the clean outline seen on the coin, a simple hemispherical crown is one reasonable reconstruction. I tried to do it with AI based on what's on the coin, and this is what it could have looked like. Again, just a possibility. Naturally, for the royal use, it could have been crafted in gold or gilded metal, although we cannot confirm the exact material. Unfortunately, very few royal objects still survive from this period. Metal regalia from nearly 1800 years ago are rare, either due to natural degradation, reuse or loss over centuries. So all we can rely on are these numismatic impressions and archaeological context to understand how these crowns might have looked. Based on the evidence, a simple metal crown such as this remains a strong possibility for the Western Kshatrapas. So the Western Kshatrapas using the metal crowns, does this mean that metal crowns began only with the Western Kshatrapas? Absolutely not. We actually have evidence that takes us much further back in time, all the way back to Indus Valley civilization roughly 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. One of the most important surviving artifacts from this period is the famous priest king bust from Mohenjo-daro. Whether this figure represents a religious leader, a political ruler, or a combination of both, forget about that, that's debated. But what's clear is that he belonged to an elite or a royal class. When we look closely at the sculpture, we see a circular headband and a matching circular ornament on his right arm. Both elements are designed in same style, suggesting that these were intentional markers of status. These bands were most likely made of metal or a similar valuable material, but definitely not cloth, because you cannot get the donut shape with cloth. So based on the form seen on the bust, a simple reconstruction of the headdress would be a metal band or a diadem placed around the head. Let's try to recreate that. This makes the Indus Valley Priest King one of the oldest surviving physical pieces of evidence, indicating that the elite individuals in the subcontinent used metal-based headdresses as well as status markers more than 5,000 years ago. If we fast forward from the Indus Valley about 5,000 years ago to last 1 or 2 centuries, we see a clear continuation of cloth-based royal headgear. For example, Maharana Sajjan Singh of Udaipur in 1877. And even today, Yaduveer Krishnadatta Chamaraja Wadiyar, the current head of Mysore royal family, both wear turbans. These turbans are cloth-based headdresses decorated with metal ornaments, possibly gold, gems and other central diadem-like elements. So this shows a very consistent pattern across time. Cloth turbans remained a primary form of royal headgear in many regions of India, even into the modern period. At the same time, metal crowns also existed in certain dynasties and specific historical contexts, as we saw earlier. So the broader conclusion is straightforward. Both turbans and crowns coexisted in India's history, but the overall trend leans more towards turbans with ornamental bands or diadems rather than full metal crowns as popularly imagined today. The coexistence of turbans and metal crowns becomes very clear when we look at the case of Tirupati. Sri Krishna Devaraya, one of the most influential rulers of both Telugu and Kannada regions, ruled about 500 to 550 years ago. He comes from the same broad geography as the Wadiyars of Mysore, whom we just saw wearing cloth-based turbans even in recent times. Yet, the bronze statues of Krishna Devaraya in Tirupati of those times, these were pretty much from the time of Krishna Devaraya himself. And it shows him with a tall headdress. Whether it was a metal or a stiffened cloth is not fully known, but the form is distinctly crown-like. At the same time, the jewelry and the ornaments that Krishna Devaraya donated to Venkateswara Swami reflect his period's royal aesthetics. The long, elongated golden crown that we see on Venkateswara Swami today is part of that tradition. In essence, the king expressed his own royal identity through his headdress, and the same royal symbolism was transferred to the deity through the ornaments he offered. This gives us an important insight. In the same cultural zone, within few centuries, we see both styles, cloth turbans and metal crowns. They clearly coexisted. The Wadiyars continued the cloth turban tradition, while the Krishna Devaraya's imagery and the crown of Venkateswara Swami show us that the elongated metal crowns were also in use at least about 500 years ago. So when we look at both the living example of Venkateswara Swami's crown and the surviving sculptures of Ashoka, the conclusion is that across different periods, both turbans and crowns existed side by side. Let me conclude this video with a very important and often overlooked insight from the Mahabharata. It's quite difficult to find this one small instance. Nonetheless, during the final battle between Karna and Arjuna, there is a moment described in Karna Parvam where Karna's arrow strikes Arjuna's crown and he loses it to the ground. So basically, Arjuna for a moment was standing in the battlefield without a crown. In ancient symbolism, losing your crown in battle represents losing your royalty, standing, or your invincibility. Even though Arjuna may not have been acting as a king at that exact moment, the battle itself was for kingship and honor. So he could not afford that humiliation. The text says that Arjuna immediately picked up a white cloth and tied it around his head and continued fighting with Karna. This detail is extremely significant because it shows that even a simple cloth tied around the head functioned as a symbol of dignity and royal presence. A turban did not need gold or jewels to represent authority. The act of tying itself is called a mukuta. This point becomes even more interesting because when we recall the term Pattabhishekam, the coronation ceremony, Patta literally means cloth. Abhishekam is the ritual, as we all know, anointing with sacred waters. The word itself suggests that a cloth headdress, not necessarily a metal crown, was central to the symbolism of Pattabhishekam. So overall, throughout India's history, both turbans and crowns coexisted, but in a majority of the cases, the cloth headdresses appear to have been the primary symbol of authority, with metal crowns serving as an additional embellishment depending on the region and period. To the person who asked this question, I'm sorry I lost that message somewhere, but I remember the topic, even I lost the original message. I hope this gave you a clear and reliable explanation, and if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to leave your questions in the comments or send me a DM or email me at projectshivoham@gmail.com. I will continue choosing a few interesting questions and answering them with simple, authentic and research-backed explanations. And before I end, if you like the kind of content I create here, I also have a new YouTube channel called Sensei. On that channel, I explain latest developments in AI as well as the core concepts in a very simple language, easy using metaphors, all within 3 minutes. It's designed for anyone who wants to understand AI better, whether you're a student or a working professional. If AI is relevant to you, and if you feel I make sense in those videos, do visit the channel and consider subscribing. It will genuinely help me a lot. I'll leave the link to Sensei channel in the pinned comment and the description of this video. Do check. And as always, thanks for watching.